For joining today. Before I go ahead and get started with my presentation, I want to pass to our interpreters to do a little presentation on how the interpretation today will work. So if you want to go ahead and take it away.
Gracias, entonces ya podemos comenzar. Vamos a aprender la grabación y ahora me gustaría pasarle a los intérpretes que van a presentar sobre cómo va a funcionar la interpretación.
Hola, mi nombre es Rosy y junto con mis compas Catalina, Vida Silvestre y Vero, formamos parte del equipo de Justicia del Lenguaje para esta conferencia.
Hi everyone, my name is Rosy and together with Catalina, Vida Silvestre and Vero, we form part of the Language Justice team for this conference.
El equipo de NISOC se ha comprometido a la justicia del lenguaje y esta porción será bilingüe e interpretará de español a inglés y del inglés al español.
NISAG is committed to language justice. And this portion will be bilingual and interpreted from Spanish to English and English to Spanish.
La función de interpretación ya está activada.
The interpretation function has already been activated.
Para acceder a la función desde su computadora, busque en el globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla y elija la interpretación de idiomas. Luego, seleccione su canal de idiomas.
To access the interpretation function from your computer, find the globe at the bottom of your screen and choose language interpretation. Then select your language channel.
Para acceder a la función de su teléfono o tableta, busque los 3 puntos en la parte inferior de la pantalla y toque más. Luego, interpretación de idiomas, seleccione su canal de idiomas y toque finalizar. Este es el último paso, el que activa la función.
And to access the function from your phone or tablet, please find the 3 dots on the bottom of your screen and select More, then Language Interpretation, then select your language channel and make sure that you click on Done. This last step is what activates the interpretation function.
Todos los participantes deben elegir un canal de interpretación, a no ser que entiendan ambos idiomas, inglés y español.
So everyone has to choose a language channel. Unless you understand both English and Spanish, everyone should be choosing a channel.
Si tienen alguna dificultad accediendo a la función de interpretación, por favor, mandarle un mensaje a Analina por el chat y le ayudarán a resolverlo.
And if you're having any issues with accessing the interpretation function, please send a chat message to Analina and they will support you in resolving any issues.
Ahora vamos a probar los canales de interpretación.
Okay, now we're gonna test the language channels.
Si me estás escuchando actualmente, estamos hablando en español y la interpretación la debería de estar escuchando en inglés. Ahora vamos a tratar now you're hearing me in English, but you will be listening to the interpretation in Spanish. Crear espacios multilingües es un esfuerzo colectivo y se hace aún más importante en espacios agrícolas, donde sabemos que la mayoría de las personas que sostienen nuestro sistema alimentario hablan múltiples idiomas. Les invitamos a poner en el chat todos los idiomas presentes acá para nombrar, honrar y reconocer que nuestras comunidades son multilingües. Estas son algunas de las maneras que todos podemos apoyar el compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje durante esta reunión. Por favor, diga su nombre antes de hablar. Las personas escuchando la interpretación no siempre se dan cuenta cuando el hablante ha cambiado. Sus comentarios en el chat serán traducidos por Vida Silvestre y Vero. Si pueden, por favor, hagan sus comentarios en inglés y español para que todos podamos accederlos con más facilidad. Si no, por favor, haga su comentario en el idioma de preferencia. Favor de acordarse de reseleccionar su canal de idioma si vamos a grupos pequeños. De vez en cuando necesitamos comunicarnos con el hablante. Para no interrumpir la reunión, usamos diferentes señales. Habla más despacio. Habla más duro. Una persona a la vez. Respirar, pausa o aclaración. Silenciar el micrófono cuando no está hablando. Finalmente, a los escuchantes del canal de interpretación en español, notarán que usamos terminaciones en E cuando refiriendo a una persona en vez de la tradicional A o. No es un error de pronunciación, sino es una decisión deliberada para resistir el binario de género y construir la inclusividad de género. Cualquier problema con la interpretación, déjennos saber inmediatamente. Manden un mensaje por el chat. Gracias por su compromiso con la justicia del lenguaje. Y le pasamos a nuestro anfitrión.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Salem, and I use they, them pronouns, and I'm coming to you from the city of Poughkeepsie on Lenape territory. I want to thank the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Working Group, the language interpreters who are interpreting this session, and to the Wallace Center who are providing technical assistance for this session. That is here to offer a little bit of insight in order to stimulate discussion amongst everyone who has decided to participate today. So again, I thank you for that. A lot of these concepts are not new. However, they are now more critical to understand and to help to promote, especially now coming out of the 2 years that we've just witnessed and lived through. And so I offer you ways that we can start to approach how to end the 50-year feeding emergency. And I'm coming to you wearing a number of different hats. I am the legislative chair of the City of Poughkeepsie Common Council. So I help to pass laws, act as a voice and a representative of the City of Poughkeepsie community, and help to run legislative sessions in order to promote different priorities that other council members in the community have that come from the voices or should come from the voice of the community. I'm also the co-founder and co-facilitator of the Hudson Valley Food Systems Coalition, which is a transdisciplinary coalition working in the Hudson Valley in order to cultivate a just and equitable Hudson Valley food shed. And I am the Director of Development and Strategic Initiatives with an organization called Duchess Outreach. We're a food access organization that exists in the city of Poughkeepsie that provides food access and emergency relief programs to residents of Dutchess County. The city of Poughkeepsie is a city in the Hudson Valley, actually nestled right in the center of the Hudson Valley, of around 32,000 individuals, which is incredibly diverse and has experienced different periods of economic booms, economic busts. And like many small American cities across the country, was just coming out of a financial crisis following the recession of 2008 to be hit with a global pandemic. And through that, we were positioned as a fringe city ready to make a resurgence. However, kind of lopsided by what was and has been a really, really difficult 2 years. And that difficulty is faced across all levels of the community, regardless of income. Folks, obviously, that are more of marginalized populations are suffering at higher instances. However, a lot of the issues that we're encountering now as a city, as a community, have been issues now are just worse than they were. And a lot of folks who had been worse off are feeling it more than others. But there are certain needs that could stand to be filled now as we move forward in the community. And we're not unlike, the city of Poughkeepsie is not unlike many other communities that are in the Hudson Valley. So it's very easy to relate to some of the experiences that we have in the city of Poughkeepsie. The Hudson Valley Food Systems Coalition is a model coalition of working groups that was established around 2 years ago. And again, it's transdisciplinary in nature in that we have partners over 100 from different parts of the food system. So for-profit industry, nonprofit industry, from healthcare sector, education sector, distribution, aggregation, farm workers, agriculture generally, resource and waste recovery sectors. And the aim of the coalition is to have active groups working together in order to promote priorities in a cohesive way across the region. So to share insight and ideas, to collaborate on projects. And the way that the coalition currently operates is that it gathers quarterly for full coalition meetings and then bi-monthly in different interest groups. So we have a farm and ag interest group, a processing and aggregation interest group, a core values interest group that, as you can see on this outer circle, that really focuses on some of the core values that we hold as a working group, as a coalition. We have a food security interest group, which I now facilitate, and we have a resource and waste recovery interest group. And the priorities of this coalition are set by the participants. This coalition has emerged as an organic process. The interest groups came from the first meeting in the coalition, set by the members that were present at that point, and has moved through an iterative process to get to where it is today. Dutchess Outreach, a food access organization that has existed in the community here in Dutchess County for more than 47 years. We provide hot meals through a hot meal prep from scratch program called the Lunchbox. We provide free groceries out of our food pantry that is now centered on a choice model. And that came from what the community experienced through the pandemic and the needs that they were able to communicate to us and how they wanted to access their food. We have a fresh mobile market, which is a farmer's market that we manage. On that program, we are accepting payment for the food because it is all locally grown here in the Hudson Valley. And so we don't want to undervalue, the farmers' work on that food. And we do want to offer a more equitable path for folks to accessing food in our community. And that comes from a range of different incomes. We do also have an urban farm and community garden. And what we're offering at Dutchess Outreach is more of a comprehensive community food security solution through food access and the way that we're able to ensure that folks in our community have access to the best food possible and can also share a part of the bounty that is produced here in one of the greatest agricultural regions of the country. So what just happened through the pandemic, through the last 2 years, what we found was that we were confronted with issues that had been, very prevalent to us, especially in the field and in the food security field, food access field prior. But really, we had no other option but to confront them in an emergency way, as we have been for the last 50 years when the emergency feeding system was established based on the lack of coordination of the federal government, the need for more safety net programming, and for folks who weren't able to get support or benefits from the government to get what they needed as far as basic needs, to have those basic needs met. And what we were seeing through the pandemic was that these needs not only persisted, but they worsened when it came to food insecurity. Many folks that had already been impacted were continuing to experience ails of food security or food insecurity, and the risks were even larger and greater through a public health crisis. What we found additionally was that a lot of people that were either, food insecure at one point of their life or another were just one paycheck away or one income earner away from falling right back into the system, from needing assistance from organizations like Dutchess Outreach, from needing to apply for federal benefit assistance dollars. And, it really demonstrated the precarity of our economy for a lot of people, and, really, kind of showed us what the income inequality in this country, how very, fragile and vulnerable it is, and how people, through this pandemic were facing situations that caused them to have to spend more money on childcare, taking care of sick family members, and the list goes on. And what, again, worsened even further for Black and Brown community members and Americans were that our health disparities widened even more than they had been before. So we saw through the pandemic that Black and Brown Americans were dying at higher rates than white Americans. The instance of health disparity in our community were already kind of blown apart on racial lines. And we were seeing that again persist. The supply chain, that was one of the things that, we're still experiencing right now, a supply chain failure, incredible supply chain failure. Farmers didn't know where to put their food. Their markets shut down. So the restaurants were shutting down, the schools were shutting down, their wholesale markets for food were failing, and they didn't have any systems in place to redirect the food to organizations that could take it and then get that food back out into the community. And so, we saw programs like Nourish New York pop up in New York State, which was a program, introduced by the governor, and I'm sure a lot of other really, really smart people who suggested it to prevent food from being plowed under. And, one of the examples that they use most often was the dairy market. Farmers were dumping milk because they had no market to sell it. And they didn't know how to get it to the food banks or the smaller food pantries in order to reduce the food waste that was created by the supply chain failure due to the closures that we experienced through the coronavirus pandemic. Communities rose to meet the occasion, again, as evidenced by innovative programs, innovative ways to connect farmers to food access organizations, to connect new markets, to fill and close the gaps. So governments stepped up and they offered short-term financial relief to community members, short-term financial relief to farmers, to nonprofits, to businesses. Nonprofits, continue to do what they were, introduced to do, and that is feed the community, provide support and relief services, and connect community members to those applications and to those funds through the pandemic. Mutual aid networks were one of, the things that showed the real silver lining to the pandemic, in that we had groups of people on the ground who had never operated a business or nonprofit, get themselves together in order to connect the dots and connect the pieces that were left, through the pandemic, kind of blown apart by the emergency and the crisis and the nature of those instances, in order to ensure that folks had the support that they needed through it, which really, shows that it's a community, it should be a community grounded and centered experience and solution. The complexities that were presented to us through the pandemic only demonstrated not that we couldn't overcome them, but that the solution would be just as complex. And that was the case in the food system. I know personally what we found in the Hudson Valley were that, groups of folks were gathering over Zoom to try and figure out how they could help to feed the increased number of folks that were experiencing food insecurity, who couldn't leave their homes, and not just feed them calories, but get them farmed foods from farmers, small farmers that lost their market completely. And now, as we continue to work our way through this situation, we're trying to figure out, as a nonprofit, as businesses, how we can continue to increase the availability of these foods in our communities. Now we're seeing the caseloads go down, vaccinations are up. Kids can now get vaccinated between 5 and 11 years old. Booster shots are available. We're headed to a more positive state of existence as a community. So we go back to normal, right? Wrong. Right. One of the things during the pandemic, and one of the things I'm going to be honest with you, quite disappointed about at this current moment, is we had an incredible opportunity to really pivot, to really, adapt and respond to the needs that were being thrown up in our faces as a community, and, change the structure of the way that our communities exist in order to meet them. So we don't have an opportunity to go back to normal, so that when the next public health emergency or the next crisis, which is coming, hits, we'll be ready for it, and we'll have these networks and these connections already, staged and ready to go, especially as it relates to the food system and how to direct food to people. So there is no going back to normal. And so one of the things that we need to start to think of as community members, as advocates, as activists and organizers, farmers, nonprofit workers, business owners, and general population, is how can we really start to address the long-standing needs so that our communities have a chance at a recovery. And it's not just about food. We have to nest the other kinds of systems that exist side by side, knowing that our community is only as strong as its weakest link. And in order to do that and develop a more equitable food system, we need to identify the gaps in our community. So as an example, I can cite what we experience here in the city of Poughkeepsie. We have very, very low stock of affordable housing. We have an unhoused population that's growing and growing. We're experiencing still a drug opioid epidemic and crisis. We don't have the necessary wraparound services to treat addiction and recovery in a way that makes sense for folks that are experiencing it, as well as mental health issues, going through mental health crises. And so we have, lack of industry to help to promote jobs in the community. And all of these things need to be kind of strung together and improved upon, where we have an opportunity to address the root cause of what it is that allows people, by just losing one paycheck, to fall so easily into food insecurity. And that's poverty, right? One of the root causes that, and the income inequality that continues to grow and grow in this country as wages continue to stagnate, as the cost of goods continue to rise. We're seeing food costs continue to go up and up, the cost of our gasoline to heat our homes, and all of the rest of the things that we are, we as a community, as community members, are required to to buy into in order to survive. And so how can we start to think of ways that we can help strengthen and bolster our community while we're building wealth from the ground, so that everyone benefits, so that we have benefits for our farmers, so that we're benefiting people, so that we're benefiting, organizations in our community on a whole. As far as community food security goes, we're talking about a number of different components that contribute to making community food security exist on a level that can be stabilized and maintained, and even, strengthened. And that is food availability. We have food access efforts and food sovereignty. So food availability, and these are pretty self-explanatory, but I'll go through them just a little. Anyways, food availability is, are we bringing in enough food that we want to see? So fresh foods into our community as so to irrigate the market. And how are we doing that? How are we ensuring that we're increasing availability of these foods across the community so that we can make them more accessible to folks who may not have the means to go outside of the community to access them? That's that question. And then how are people able to get those foods once they're here in community? Are they purchasing food? Are there free food programs? Are there subsidized food programs? In what way are we stimulating our economy in order to grant further or strengthen the access to these fresh foods in our communities? And then, what kind of food are we bringing into the community? And are we able to offer a choice to folks that is culturally appropriate, that makes them feel like they can maintain a quality of health within their their own bound of what that means and what that exists? And so really what we're tackling, and we're trying to tackle more on a community level in Poughkeepsie and in my work at Dutchess Outreach and across the board in the Hudson Valley, is to increase the availability of fresh foods. There is a market for fresh foods in our community that is completely untapped. And I understand that the farm to community movement has existed for a while now. However, it has existed in a way that others certain people, that remove certain people from the table, that disallows our clients at Dutchess Outreach, our guests, from being able to access food, and even makes them feel as if they don't deserve fresh foods, as if those foods don't belong on their table. And we can't continue to move forward in that way as a community. Across income levels, what has been shown is consumers are willing to pay more. They're willing to pay more as far as the price of food in order to access healthier foods, and that's across the board. And we've been able to demonstrate that ourselves at Dutchess Outreach, since we have a a revenue model where you can access food versus a free food model where you can access the same exact food from farms. We're noticing that, when people can, the same guests that come to our food pantry come to our market and they purchase foods when they're able to. For every $1 million of revenue that's generated from farmers selling directly to their community, we're creating 32 jobs. And that is distinct from the wholesale revenue market, where for every $1 million revenue generated in wholesale, we're only creating around 10.5 jobs. So again, another point of evidence to demonstrate that there is a market in our communities for fresh foods. And so how do we get it there? How do we increase availability of these foods? Quite simply, we need to invest public funds in our community in order to strengthen food systems development. And so we need to start to examine policies that encourage good food purchasing, different procurement policies, so that our anchor and stakeholder institutions like our schools, our hospitals, our prisons are required to an extent to purchase local foods, to purchase foods from farmers, to purchase food from farmers who have been historically marginalized. So BIPOC community farmers that don't necessarily have that market available to them, who would want nothing more than to sell their food directly to the community in which they exist or close by. We need to stimulate the development of community gardens and urban agriculture. And we can do this through zoning ordinances. And again, investing in organizations that help to capture and, cultivate these kinds of initiatives. We as a community can leverage our own purchasing power to start to transition food to more of a public utility, so that we're offering fresh food to our community at a price that people are willing to pay, maybe even at a discount, depending on what they're willing to pay in to the system. Food policy councils. There are no food policy councils currently in existence in the Hudson Valley. And if we were able to coordinate ourselves well enough and establish these bodies, then we would be able to tackle those first three priorities that I just named, and attract funds from the state governments, from our county governments, even from our local governments, to ensure that we're feeding our food system, that we're irrigating our markets with fresh food, and as well as investment in food enterprise, cooperative, shared kitchen spaces, offering a path toward, for small business owners to get up and get started in food business, so that they have a place to process and aggregate their products, so that they can, have a shot at selling them in community as well. Cooperative food hubs and markets, cooperative food processing plants that we need, and, ways that we can transform food access projects. And then quite simply, make direct payments to farmers and direct payments to people. Right now, we have a once in a lifetime opportunity in most small American cities, and that is through the American Rescue Plan funds. Excuse me while I take a sip of water.
Thank you so much for all, excuse me, all of the rich and powerful information that you're sharing, Salem. We have a request
slow
from
down.
the
Yes,
interpretation team to please slow down if you can, just so that we
Absolutely.
can make sure that we render all of the important information that you're sharing. Thank you so
Great.
much.
yes, thanks for that reminder. I couldn't see your screen, so I wasn't looking for it, but I should have assumed. So a lot of American cities have received funds from the federal government, in upwards of millions of dollars. The city of Poughkeepsie has received around $20 million. And the way that you can spend those funds is, yes, to plug budget deficits, excuse me. But another way is to provide direct support to community members, and to provide direct support to organizations and businesses that help to address a specific need that became even more apparent through the coronavirus. And that is food insecurity, our food systems, the need to develop our food systems so that they work for community, so that we're able to work for farmers, and so that we can establish, different kinds of ways to move forward to address these needs. Excuse me. So communities really hold the power. We hold the power. We just have to know and figure out how to best leverage it, how to advocate for our needs in a better way, how to write letters to our legislators in order to attract those funds so that they don't pass us by, and so that we can strengthen our local food system, and we can make a food system that works for the many and not for just the few. So I ask everyone here, and I want to kind of have an open-ended discussion to learn if people are currently working on initiatives that tackle any of the points that I just made, if people have thoughts on whether or not we're able to exit a poverty economy for food and bring people back to the same table. And are we able as a community to create a food economy that is centered more on equity, and that is inclusive, and that really takes a whole comprehensive look at all of the pieces, not just one. At what expense are we doing one thing versus another? And can we figure out a way where we can increase food availability, increase the market, and introduce more local food into each of our communities so that our farmers benefit, our farm workers benefit, community members across the board are able to benefit, and we're stimulating our economy and building community wealth. So I'd love to open up for discussion. I know I just talked at you a lot. but I would like to hear where everyone is at with, you know, again, things that they've been working on in their community. Is if they know of, you know, a food policy council that exists or have an idea of ways that they think we can build more equity in our food system. And again, so I mentioned the poverty economy, and, you know, I work at a food access organization, and we do deal with a lot of our guests that are kind of, you know, given SNAP benefits, which are incredible. And actually another fun or very interesting and relevant statistic is in SNAP issuance, what we found is the more money you have available to you in SNAP, the more likely you're spending that money on healthier and fresh foods, local foods when you have the opportunity to. So, you know, from that, we can see that, you know, there's no question as to whether or not communities that tend to have a higher instance, you know, of diet-related illness, but a lower income level don't deserve this food too, and the availability of the food. So yeah, and we can record the discussion as well. So I'll just open up for folks, either ask questions of me or just to speak whatever it is on your mind. I really want this to be kind of a free flow. Oh, sorry, I missed all those notes about slowing down. Any questions, comments?
Comment. I have a comment.
Sure.
Oh, so this is Deborah Trapp. I just tweeted this out, so I just thought I very much appreciated your comments about treating good food as a public utility. It reminded me also of a conversation I had. Oh, hey, Lindsay, I see your face. Nodding, which I appreciate. Someone who knows. Two things that really stuck out for me. One was the fact that you emphasize shared value across the food value chain, which I think is so important, that it's sometimes too easy in discussions of equity to don't think about equity for producers. Making sure that they too can make a decent living, that our farm workers are treated appropriately, and, you know, all of the labor issues, and you know, the making sure that the rewards benefit people, you know, commensurate with their contributions and participation in the chain. The other was I was involved in a short conversation a couple of weeks ago as part of the National Farm Viability Conference with some folks who were talking about how we need to do a better job. Sorry if I'm talking too fast. Of lobbying for research funds from, you know, for that aren't formula based, that aren't you know, or just one-offs or additions to the Farm Bill, but actually built in to our regulatory agenda. And as a former USDA person who worked as research and market analysis on local food systems, I think that's also something we need to add to our list of priorities. How might we both build in benefits to a wider range of farmers, including direct payments to farmers, as you mentioned, forgive me for that sound, as well as thinking about how do we make sure that we empower our career people and our subject matter specialists to have the resources necessary to make sure that we have the data we need, understand the relationships, do some of the deep dives into structural issues. So just wanted to, you know, make a shout out for people in economic research functions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I wholeheartedly agree. I know a lot of projects never materialize because the funding just isn't there. And some of that data, you know, some of the data that we work with even could stand to be updated, especially now, you know, having money to go and conduct that research. And I feel lucky that there are, organizations like the Cooney Institute down in the city that are working on projects that naturally, involve, because it's for food policy, the work that occurs up in the Hudson Valley. So they're funded and they bring the work up here. But it would be nice if we could have some kind of line of reciprocity in that. And we were more coordinated in that lobbying so that we could attract funds, regionally for those kinds of projects. I appreciate your comment, Deborah.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions, discussion generally? And, I have been thinking a lot. I had a conversation with somebody recently about, food as a public utility. In the city of Poughkeepsie, we went through a program that helped to aggregate buying power for electricity in order to divest. And so now we source our electricity from 100% renewable sources as the default supply, which is pretty incredible. And I've been thinking, how can we apply that kind of movement to food, locally farmed foods? How can we ensure, communities, if they're willing, that are paying in, can benefit at all levels across the board from the value and the product that is being grown so thoughtfully by our farmers. So that's something, I know that there are ways that other communities across the country, again, with good food purchasing policies and other kinds of initiatives. I don't know if they're, we do pay taxes to some extent for industrial food supply. How can we apply that, in order to benefit communities on a more local level? Any other questions or comments?
Salem, since you have a quiet group, I'll take advantage to just say one more thing.
Sure.
And one of the things I've been thinking about myself, I very much like your comment about, renewable energy. I keep on thinking now, if we want to be really transformative, I mean, this is a little bit dreaming, but gosh, what if we actually looked at school food as a way of actually modeling proper nutrition? And we actually funded school meals, so food programs in a way that allowed us to actually do that honestly, instead of it being, just sort of an outgrowth of, or trying to tweak a program that really was created, the World War II era, post-war, to prevent, or to make sure that, that we had, correct the problems that were stemming from people being underweight, not having access to enough food. It was never predicated on the idea that we were dealing with an obesity crisis or teaching young people how to prepare food, understand its connection into health, building it into our health and nutrition education. I just think it's a very ambitious task, but I think if we really are talking about restructuring, we often get hung up on, talking about subsidy programs going to commodity farmers. But equally, I think we need to think about how do we budget and how do we fund our current school feeding programs, and what are the expectations? Are they expected to be financially self-sufficient? We even see them in different parts of the country as an educational model. Now, I know I am talking a bit out of my lane here. I'm not an expert, so I defer to those who know more about the details. But it is something I think about frequently, and wonder if we can have, broader conversations about this issue down the line.
Yeah, I think that that's a good starting point for a conversation. I often wonder why we were trying to you know, I know I'm like a policy maker and a public official, but I'm always wondering why we're trying to fix things that were designed not to work, rather than just, you know, invest and kind of approach it from a way to try something new and try something different, knowing that we have an opportunity now to fund those kinds of initiatives, especially in the schools, and yeah, change the curriculum in order to, you know, set us on a path where we may not have this, you know, this disparity. I know, coming from the perspective of working in an emergency food program, knowing that this emergency, we can't continue to treat it like an emergency, this emergency of food insecurity, and the inability to access certain foods, let alone food, across the board. And how can we, you know, ensure that, or how can we move ourselves away from that environment, and reduce the stigma attached to our programs and restore the dignity that people deserve when they walk through the door. And we've been exploring different models that exist of, you know, just opening a market. You get free food if you can't pay for it. You pay a lower rate if you can pay anything at all, or you pay market rate. And because you're paying more, folks that can't pay anything at all come in, they get the same exact food for free. And, you know, that's the way it exists. And we're not othering anyone. And we're not saying, okay, well, you can't pay, so you can only deserve this type of food. When we know that that doesn't really promote well-being across the community in a way that, you know, helps us to cultivate these ideals that we tend to promote as, you know, legislators or leaders, and knowing that we need to start bringing up the ground for folks so everyone has some kind of viable shot at, you know, achieving the opportunity that they've been promised.
Very nice.
Any other comments, thoughts?
I'm wondering, this is Lindsay Gilmore. Does anyone in the session have much experience of larger hunger programs, feeding programs? I know that I have very peripheral experience of this kind of thing. Susan, maybe you do. The reliance on commodity foods in those programs, there's really big money being exchanged, it seems to me, that isn't going to local food systems. And it would be interesting to know what the barriers are, same as in school feeding programs. There, I mean, that's where I have a little bit more background in farm to institution, and the, you know, the larger global food system is so incredibly efficient and entangled with food procurement in those institutions that it's very difficult to, you can't really force a way for local food into that program, into that system. You really need to create something different, I think. This is how I'm feeling at this point after so many years of trying to make it work. Yeah, so I don't know, Susan or anyone else have any experience of things, you know, like the one in Philadelphia that I'm familiar with is Philabundance, and there's huge amounts of money being exchanged, but mostly with commodity programs or with free commodities coming into the system as well.
So yeah, Lindsay, it really depends on the state, I think. You know, here in Pennsylvania, we have the PASS funding, which is state funding for the Pennsylvania Agricultural Surplus System, and that's where you get local food into your food security system that exists now, which is your food banking system. And then there's some on a larger scale that goes through the TFAP, the commodity funding through USDA. But when you're really looking at local development, you know, like here in the Lehigh Valley, where we look at our local development, we just don't have the land or the farms to even meet the local demand. You know, and I think that that's an issue, you know, all throughout the Northeast, that there is a real difficulty in meeting the local demand. And when you have, you know, an already high demand for local, then that also tends to price it out of the food security market, unless you have some sort of supports like Double SNAP, which is generally GovSNP funded through the USDA. And that, from a policy point of view, I think those are where you really make the impact, where we're looking at our Double SNAP GovSNP program will be ending, that we've been running for several years. And so now we're looking at a bigger private public partnership to really more or less institutionalize that. And but then there's also the thing you need to think about. Double SNAP is a great program, but here in the Lehigh Valley, and I think this is true, Salem, I think you've probably found this in your area in the Hudson Valley, that we have so many folks that don't qualify for SNAP, that are living paycheck to paycheck. And it's what United Way calls the Alice family, that are asset limited, income constrained. They're working and make just a little bit too much money to qualify for those support programs, but they're one paycheck away from a disaster. And those are, you know, those are the families that we really need to look at. How do we help them reach and attain sustainability for a healthy, nutritious lifestyle?
Those are all really great points. And I know some of those programs we have here in New York State. And, you know, one of the leaders in the industry for us are the regional food banks. We're a partner of the regional food bank, knowing if they were able to attract enough funding and the availability, you know, could be met. And they could help to kind of transition the way that they are distributing food to their partners. We could see a change really easily. But I know that that's not easy for them. And I know our local regional food bank partners are working on building a facility so that they can do that. And that's another thing, our infrastructure isn't up to what it needs to be. We don't have great places to aggregate food. You know, one of the exciting things that's happened recently in New York State is Hunts Point down in the city, where they're able now to aggregate a lot of food. But with that, what support are we going to see here in the Hudson Valley, where a lot of that food is being grown? So I'm hoping that, you know, instead of the extractive nature that we've had, or the extractive relationship that the Hudson Valley farms and farmers have had with New York City, we might see a little bit more kind of passed up here. But again, it is kind of, are we able to meet the demand? If we all start, you know, if all communities start to switch over and start to procure local foods, are we going to, you know, see a real kind of issue on the farm level? And knowing it's hard enough for starting farmers to gain access to land and the tools and the training that they need. And, you know, the larger farmers already have markets available to them even now as we exit a pandemic. But I mean, I do see that there's a big difference between the different levels of, you know, food access org and the way we're tackling food security in the community. Those are good points.
Okay, I'm going to ask another question. I was in Cuba a couple of years ago, and I, again, very, very superficially became aware that there were food markets for people, kept very low prices. Everybody could access those markets. Does anyone on the call know anything more about that system? Obviously, it's a different kind of political system in that country, but I'm curious if anyone has any knowledge of it. Levels the playing field. And I also feel like the terminology that's used, contract feeding, well, what was the other term? What in the food security world, there's another term. It's so dehumanizing.
Yes.
It sounds like you're feeding chickens.
Right, right, exactly right. It's a whole nother system. And it's kind of like stimulating the colonial neoliberal, idea that this is the way that the system it works, but it's not working. I don't have any knowledge personally about the Cuba food markets. It sounds great. I don't know if anyone does, please jump in, because I think that if we had markets like that in our community, we'd be a lot better off. And I know that there are models across the country that test fair share pricing systems and variable price models. But again, it's really about how can we allow people to be able to or have a shot at participating in their community and feeling that they're a part of the community, specifically when it comes to food. So appreciate those comments, questions. Does anyone else have any questions, discussion, really anything? Feel free. I don't know if anyone, Susan, go
I'll
ahead.
just jump in here. It takes a lot of thinking outside of the box, especially since, there are probably some of us that are, like Lindsay and I are of one generation, and then there are others of another generation. But there are many of us who've been working in food systems for years and years, and so we have certain types of thinking ingrained into us, like devise the program, develop the program, get the funding for the program, that sort of thing. And we really need to think outside of the box. And there are different, obviously different levels of income that folks need healthy food access for. But one of the things that we've found is that our food recovery folks have really worked very actively in tying together those folks. Well, let me back up a minute. There's been the assumption that, well, why don't we develop, urban gardens or community gardens where people can grow their own food? But of course, folks who can least afford it really don't have the time and the energy to grow their own food. So that's not necessarily a true, a valid assumption that one can make. And so our food recovery folks have really done an excellent job of tying together those spaces and places and groups of people, whether they be individuals or an entire group, who have the time and the opportunity to grow, but may not necessarily have an outlet for what they grow. And so we have, most of our pantries now have a garden specifically growing in the growing season for them to provide fresh produce during the growing season. And some of them are on site at the pantry, and some of them are off site, with volunteers that are making sure that everything gets grown, harvested, and picked specifically for that pantry. And now we're moving into that next generation where we are finding that we're having excess produce. So we're moving to that generation where we're grappling with how, what do we do? How can we preserve it to get a preservation system, whether it be drying, freezing, canning, and doing it in a safe method. So that's the next iteration. So really, you're recreating the local, from times ago, but it's and you're leveraging the abilities, the time of folks that have that available.
Right, right. And it's kind of getting away from having emergency feeding organizations to creating jobs where people can continue to feed each other. You know, there's this savior complex, this white savior complex that exists in the nonprofit world. And we really, you know, need to blast it apart and start to figure out ways where we can bring food into community and have community, you know, kind of nourish each other in a way that doesn't feel kind of diminutive and othering, as you said. And yeah, as far as the aggregation and processing, what we found is, you know, people know what food they should be eating, and we have it for them. But a lot of the times, if it's not processed correctly, they just don't have the time to cook it, you know, between the number of jobs that they're working, the number of other responsibilities that they have. If, you know, that butternut squash were just chopped up, I would prefer it even, you know, I'm not gonna go home after, you know, a 16-hour day to cook and like process down a butternut squash. I'm tired. But if it were cut up, I'd throw it in a pot, you know, like, so we have to think of ways that we can continue to make the local healthy choice the easy, affordable choice for people, rather than the opposite. So and I appreciate kind of, you know, the different stages of the work that we do and how we're kind of moving in from one to another. But, you know, I know, like, for me personally, I had an executive director that I worked with that used to run by the line, you know, we're here to put ourselves out of work. And now, unfortunately, because of income inequality, because basic needs are not being met, we're not here to put ourselves out of work necessarily, but we're here to transition the way that communities access food and can feed themselves, that in a way that's more inclusive and equitable, and in a way that builds power and strength in the community. I think that that's kind of like a paradigm shift that we have to, you know, conceptualize and figure out what makes the most sense and how we can move that forward. And I'm biased, but I think a lot of it has to do with policy and, you know, local government funds, but also, you know, federal government, the way that they're able to support communities in the way of food security, and county and state level government. I see the chat is very lively and I appreciate it. Just want to make that known. Are there any other comments, questions, insights, pieces of discussion that anyone wants to offer? This is Salem. Well, if there's nothing, I appreciate those who participated, made comments. Thanks to everyone for coming today. Thank you to our language interpreters. It was an incredible opportunity to have this session interpreted. And I think that, you know, being on Zoom makes it even more possible. I would love to hear experience from being in person rather than Zoom as far as interpretation goes. And thank you so much to the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Working Group for having me. Really appreciate the space and the time. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the conference, and hopefully I'll catch you in another session.
Salem, I think you were tackling a topic that is the truly wicked problem we're dealing with in our society. So it's a really hard one for people to have good ideas about.
I thank you. I appreciate that. And I know that, you know, we need to continue to talk and ideate on this, you know, and figure out, you know, what the barriers are that exist, you know, and then that's the only way we'll be able to tackle it and come up with a solution. So I appreciate, you know, what you've been able to contribute today. And it's an ongoing process, and we'll have to continue to talk because it's the way through. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.